right.
Hello, hello, everyone. It's your favorite rat, SkitterSkreetch. And with that last delightful message, it is the hour, so please allow me to welcome you, all of you who are here, and all of you who will see this in the future. As I have said, and as is made clear, I think, in the title of the stream. Oh no, it's not, I didn't even mention it. How foolish. Well, little matter, I suppose. But as is hopefully made clear by these badges that I'm currently standing before, today is the 100th stream I have done on this channel. And so in celebration of that, I have rather taken a moment to clean up my act and make things a little bit more...
Abe 4713 has pledged himself to Lamp as a tier 1 initiate.
Well, thank you very kindly, Abbe. I do so appreciate your joining us in this way. As I was saying, this is our 100th stream on this channel, and while not perhaps anyone here's 100th stream, I'm certain that Abbe cannot be too far off. But there is an order of these things, so let's move through. There were no followers to thank, but of course Abbe has just changed that, so thank you once more, Abbe. I do so appreciate it. To our next order of business. Oh. Well, let's see. Here we are, yes. Plague claims first today. I am always so appreciative of those who are eager to be here. Thank you kindly. It has been a rather remarkable journey. It's strange. In some ways it feels like no time at all, and yet in some ways it feels like I have been doing this forever. And of course I would not be here without all of you. And so I want to take a little bit of time to reflect on some of the things we've done before we start. But there is still business to attend to. Let me take care of that first, shall we? So, we've thanked the people there are to thank, and marked the people who are there to mark. But still I must push some badges. Hello Fitz, it's good to have you. But yes, badges to have, yes. So as I have said, this is a 100th stream, and to celebrate that, we have some 100 badges. Thank all of you, I do appreciate it. As always, I do like to have a follower badge, or as such a watch time badge. So if you just want to sit here and join me for an hour tonight, then you'll get my little heart badge. Just to show that I deeply appreciate and love you. And if, like Abbe, you feel that tonight is the night to subscribe and make more deep ties between us, and you shall receive a small crown, just to note that you are king or queen of my heart, as it were. Having said that, let's do a little bit of contemplation. There's somewhere I'd like to go before we begin today. I'm sure some of you have seen this shelf. I believe at least a few of you were here when I began reading Common Sense by Thomas Paine, or when I made my way through The Art of War, not The Art of War I should say, The Prince by Machiavelli. Plague, an empress does not need a crown. Her mere presence is enough. Now where was I? Yes. Now I'm sure some of you had joined me for Machiavelli's The Prince, and for The Art of War and for Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Look at how my words run away from me. But I wish to come back here because The Art of War, that slightly ugly green book there between the two, is the very first book I ever read. I don't believe anyone was here to see me read it. I remember looking at the numbers that came out afterwards, and I believe one person dropped in very briefly and left within about 2 minutes. The only memory of that, though the VOD is saved. Still, I don't necessarily recommend you watching it. There's not much to it. It was amateurish. An early beginning. We've come a long way. It was a good book, though. Perhaps something worth revisiting at another occasion. And of course there are other books here that are notable. All these little ones to build a fire. Was that the second or the third I did? I can't recall. And just above me, barely in view, White Fang, Call of the Wild. The Sea Wolf. Others we have touched. Important ones. This whole library has grown out over the course of 100 streams. Not all these books read, of course, but many of them, and all of them found and acquired. And all of it because of you. You have stood by me and supported me, have been here. Those of you who have subscribed and support me financially, and those of you who support me with your time, your energy, and your affection. I cannot truly state quite how grateful I am to all of you. But I only hope that tonight, by being a little bit closer, I can show all of you how much I do appreciate it. Now, things are a little off though, aren't they? This doesn't seem quite right for an intimate moment. Let's see. Over here is where we'll be spending the night. But the lighting is wrong, so lamp, if you would. That's a little better. Now, if I can but find my match. There we are. Perhaps not the most clean aesthetic, a little harder to see, but I hope you can appreciate the thought. Nothing quite like a Regency novel by candlelight, is there? Now, thank you, I'm glad you appreciate it. It was surprisingly hard to find a candlestick in this place that wasn't magical. Still, we persevered. Now, as this is Torrid Tuesday, we will be once again returning to Emma by Jane Austen. A book which, while not perhaps as depthful in its romance as some others, I think is pleasant enough. We'll be making our way through it as usual, one chapter at a time. I'll be trying to go a little more slowly and a little more deliberately. But as always, if it should happen that something should be missed, perhaps I skip a word, perhaps there are technical issues, perhaps merely you get lost in something, I am always very happy to go back over it. If you have thoughts, questions, comments, I'm always happy to hear from you, and I will try to answer what I can, either at the time, if the question or answer is brief, or at the end of the chapter in the breaks. I have no plans tonight for quite how long we shall go. I think rather it is to be said that we shall go until the time feels right to part. But I do hope that shall be a while. Now, I'm supposed to wait a little longer before beginning, but the time does feel right to begin, with all you lovely people here. So without any further ado, I shall take a quick swallow of water, as is good for my health. And having done this, and so long as you're all sitting comfortably, without any further ado, I shall begin. We were at chapter 15. Mr. Woodhouse and the party had just been convinced to join Mr. Knightley at his abode for a small Christmas do, the evening of the 24th, and there was some worry about them being snowed in, joined as they were by the young priest, who it seems may not be so interested in Harriet as he is in Emma herself. This is where we left off, and picking up. Chapter 15. Mr. Woodhouse was soon ready for his tea, and when he had drunk his tea, he was quite ready to go home, and it was much as his three companions could do to entertain away his notice of the lateness of the hour, before the other gentleman appeared. Mr. Weston was chatty and convivial, and no friend to early separations of any sort. But at last the drawing-room party did receive an augmentation. Mr. Elton, in very good spirits. Abbe, a 50 steam streak. Fully half the time we have been streaming entire. How remarkable, how delightful. I cannot express enough my gratitude. Mr. Elton, in very good spirits, was one of the first to walk in. Mrs. Weston and Emma were sitting together on the sofa. I appreciate it more than you can know. He joined them immediately, and with scarcely an invitation, seated himself between them. Uzumaki, welcome. I do so appreciate you. If you're not familiar, I know you're a recent follower. Today is our Torrid Tuesday streams, where we read romance novels. And given that this is our 100th stream, we're doing something a little bit more intimate than usual. There is a badge if you wish to stay for an hour at least, and another one for subscribers. Thank you very kindly, Uzumaki. Thank you for joining us, I do appreciate it. Emma, in good spirits too, from the amusement afforded to her mind by the exaltation of Mr. Frank Churchill, was willing to forget his late improprieties and be as well satisfied with him as before, and on making Harriet her very first subject, was ready to listen with the most friendly smiles. He professed himself extremely anxious about her fair friend, a fair, lovely, amiable friend. Did she know? Had she heard anything about her since their being at Randall's? He felt much anxiety. He must confess that the nature of her complaint alarmed him considerably. And in this style he talked on for some time, very properly, not much attending to any answer, but altogether sufficiently awake to the terror of the bad sore throat, and Emma was quite in charity with him. But at last there seemed a perverse turn. It seemed all at once as if he were more afraid of its being a bad sore throat on her account than on Harriet's, more anxious that she should escape the infection than there should be no infection in the complaint. He began with great earnestness to entreat her to refrain from visiting the sick chamber again for the present, to entreat her to promise him not to venture into such a hazard till he had seen Mr. Perry and learnt his opinion. And though she tried to laugh it off and bring the subject back into its proper course, there was no putting an end to his extreme solicitude about her. She was vexed. It did appear, there was no concealing it, exactly like the pretense of being in love with her instead of Harriet. An inconsistency, if real, the most contemptible and abominable. And she had difficulty in behaving with temper. He turned to Mrs. Weston to implore her assistance. Would she not give him her support? Would she not add her persuasions to his, to induce Miss Woodhouse not to go to Mrs. Goddard's till it was certain that Miss Smith's disorder had no infection? He could not be satisfied without a promise. Would not she give him her influence in procuring it? So scrupulous for others, he continued, and yet so careless for herself. She wanted me to nurse my cold by staying at home today, and yet will not promise to avoid the danger of catching catching an ulcerated sore throat herself. Is this fair, Mrs. Weston? Judge between us. Have not I some right to complain? I am sure of your kind support and aid. Emma saw Mrs. Weston's surprise, and felt that it must be great at an address which, in words and manner, was assuming himself the right of first interest in her. And as for herself, she was too much provoked and offended to have the power of directly saying anything to the purpose. She could only give him a look, but it was such a look as she thought must restore him to his senses, and then left the sofa, removing to a seat by her sister, and giving her all her attention. She had not time to know how Mr. Elton took the reproof, so rapidly did another subject succeed. For Mr. John Knightley now came into the room from examining the weather, and opened on them all with the information of the ground being covered with snow, and of it still snowing fast, without a strong drifting wind, concluding with the words to Mr. Woodhouse, "This will prove a spirited beginning of your winter engagement, sir. Something now new for your coachman and horses to be making their way through a storm of snow." Poor Mr. Woodhouse was silent from consternation, but everybody else had something to say. Everybody was either surprised or not surprised, and had some question to ask, or some comfort to offer. Mrs. Weston and Emma tried earnestly to cheer him, and turn his attention from his son-in-law, who was pursuing his triumph rather unfeelingly. "I admired your resolution very much, sir," said he, "in venturing out in such weather, for of course you saw there would be snow very soon. Everybody must have seen the snow coming on. I admired your spirit, and I dare say we shall get home very well. Another hour or two's snow can hardly make the road impassable, and we are 2 carriages. If one is blown over in the bleak part of the common field, there will be the other at hand. I dare say we shall all be safe at Hartfield before midnight." Mr. Weston was, with triumph of a different sort, was confessing that he had known it to be snowing some time, but had not said a word, lest it should make Mr. Woodhouse uncomfortable, and be an excuse for his hurrying away. As to there being any question of snow fallen or likely to fall to impede their return, that was a mere joke. He was afraid they would find no difficulty. He wished the road might be impassable, that he might be able to keep them all at Randalls, and with the utmost goodwill was sure that accommodation might be found for everybody, calling on his wife to agree with him that, with a little contrivance, everybody might be lodged, which he hardly knew how to do, from the consciousness of there being but 2 spare rooms in the house. "What is to be done, my dear Emma? What is to be done?" was Mr. Woodhouse's burst exclamation, and all that he could say for some time. To her he looked for comfort, and her assurances of safety, her representation of the excellence of the houses, and of James, and their living so many friends about them, revived him a little. His eldest daughter's alarm was equal to his own. The horror of being blocked up at Randalls while her children were at Hartfield was full in her imagination, and fancying the road to be now just passable for adventurous people, but in a state that admitted no delay, she was eager to have it settled that her father and Emma should remain at Randalls, while she and her husband set forward instantly, though all the possible accumulations of drifted snow that might impede them. "You had better order the carriage directly, my love," she said. "I dare say we shall be able to get along if we set off directly, and if we do come to anything very bad, I can get out and walk. I am not at all afraid. I should not mind walking half the way. I could change my shoes, you know, the moment I got home, and it is not the sort of thing that gives me cold." "Indeed," replied he. "Then, my dear Isabella, it is the most extraordinary sort of thing in the world, for in general everything does give you cold. Walk home. You are prettily shod for walking home, I dare say. It will be hard enough for the horses." Isabella turned to Mrs. Weston for her approbation of the plan. Mrs. Weston could only approve. Isabella then went to Emma, but Emma could not so entirely give up the hope of their being all able to get away. And they were still discussing the point when Mr. Knightley, who had left the room immediately after his brother's first report of the snow, came back again, and told them that he had been out of doors to examine, and could answer for there not being the smallest difficulty in their getting home whenever they liked it, either now or an hour hence. He had gone beyond the sweep, some way along the Highbury road. The snow was nowhere above half an inch deep, in many places hardly enough to whiten the ground. A very few flakes were falling at present, but the clouds were parting, and was every appearance of its being over soon. He had seen the coachman, and they had both agreed with him in there being nothing to apprehend. To Isabella, the relief of such a tiding was very great, and they were scarcely less acceptable to Emma on her father's account, who was immediately set as much at ease on the subject as his nervous constitution allowed. But the alarm that had been raised could not be appeased, so as to admit of any comfort for him while he continued at Randall's. He was satisfied with there being no present danger in returning home, but no assurances could convince him that it was safe to stay, and while the others were variously urging and recommending, Mr. Knightley and Emma settled it in a few brief sentences, thus: "Your father will not be easy. Why do you not go?" "I am ready, if the others are." "Shall I ring the bell?" "Yes, do." And the bell was rung, and the carriage is spoken for. A few minutes more, and Emma hoped to see one of the troublesome companions deposited in his own house to get sober and cool, and the other recover his temper and happiness when this visit of handship were over. The carriages came, and Mr. Woodhouse, always the first object on such occasions, was carefully attended to his own by Mr. Knightley and Mr. Weston. But not all that either could say could prevent some renewal of alarm at the sight of snow which had actually fallen, and the discovery of a much darker night than he had been prepared for. He was afraid they should have a very bad drive. He was afraid poor Isabella would not like it, and there would be poor Emma in the carriage behind. He did not know what they had best do. They must keep as much together as they could, and James was talked to and given a charge to go very slow and wait for the other carriage. Isabella stepped in after her father. John Knightley, forgetting that he did not belong to their party, stepped in after his wife very naturally, so that Emma found, on being escorted and followed into the second carriage by Mr. Elton, that the door was to be lawfully shut on them, and they were to have a tete-a-tete drive. It would not have been the awkwardness of a moment. It would have been rather a pleasure, previous to the suspicions of this very day. She could have talked to him of Harriet, and the 3/4 of a mile would have seemed but one. But now she would rather it had not happened. She believed he had been drinking too much of Mr. Weston's good wine, and felt sure that he would want to be talking nonsense. "Hello, Naska. Thank you for the well wishes, and thank you for stopping by. I do so appreciate you having been here. And while I know that your streak was unfortunately broken during that unpleasantness a few weeks back, I know for a fact that you have been here almost as long and diligently as Abbe, and I am very appreciative of it." Now where were we? Yes. She believed he had been drinking too much of Mr. Weston's good wine, and felt sure that he would want to be talking nonsense. To restrain him as much as might be by her own manner, she was immediately preparing to speak with exquisite calmness and gravity of the weather and the night. But scarcely had she begun, scarcely had they passed the sweep gate and joined the other carriage, that he found her subject cut up, her hand seized, her attention demanded, and Mr. Elton actually making violent love to her, availing himself of the precious opportunity, declaring sentiments which must be already well known, hoping, fearing, adoring, ready to die if she refused him, but flattering himself that his ardent attachment, and unequalled love, and unexampled passion could not fail of having some effect, and in short very much resolved on being seriously accepted as soon as possible. It really was so. Without scruple, without apology, without much apparent diffidence, Mr. Elton, the lover of Harriet, was professing himself her lover. She tried to stop him, but vainly. He would go on and say it all. Angry as she was, the thought of the moment made her resolve to restrain herself when she did speak. She felt that half this folly must be drunkenness, and therefore could hope that it might belong only to the passing hour. Accordingly, with a mixture of the serious and the playful, which she hoped would best suit his half and half state, she replied, I am very much astonished, Mr. Elton. This to me? You forget yourself. You take me for your friend. Any message to Miss Smith I shall be happy to deliver. But no more of this to me, if you please. Miss Smith? Message to Miss Smith? What could she possibly mean? And he repeated her words with such assurance of accent, such boastful pretense of amazement, that she could not help replying with quickness, Mr. Elton, this is the most extraordinary conduct, and I can account for it only in one way. You are not yourself, or you could not speak either to me or of Harriet in such a manner. Command yourself enough to say no more, and I will endeavour to forget it. But Mr. Elton had only drunk wine enough to elevate his spirits, not at all to confuse his intellects. He perfectly knew his own meaning, and having warmly protested against her suspicion, as most injurious, and slightly touched upon his respect for Miss Smith as her friend, but acknowledging his wonder that Miss Smith should be mentioned at all, he resumed the subject of his own passion, and was very urgent for a favourable answer. As she thought the less of his inebriety, she thought more of his inconsistency and presumption, and with fewer struggles for politeness replied, "It is impossible for me to doubt any longer. You have made yourself too clear. Mr. Elton, my astonishment is much beyond anything I can express. After such behaviour as I have witnessed during the last month to Miss Smith, such attentions as I have been in the daily habit of observing, to be addressing me in this manner, this is an unsteadiness of character indeed, which I had not supposed possible. Believe me, sir, I am far, very far from gratified in being the object of such professions." "Good heaven!" cried Mr. Elton. "What can be the meaning of this? Miss Smith? I never thought of Miss Smith in the whole course of my existence. Never paid her any attentions but as your friend. Never cared whether she were dead or alive but as your friend. If she has fancied otherwise, her own wishes have misled her, and I am very sorry, extremely sorry, but Miss Smith indeed. Oh, Miss Woodhouse! Who can think of Miss Smith when Miss Woodhouse is near? No, upon my honour there is no unsteadiness of character. I have thought only of yourself. I protest against having paid the smallest attention to anyone else. Everything that I have said or done for many weeks past has been with the sole view of marking my adoration of yourself. You cannot really, seriously doubt it? No, in an accent meant to be insinuating, I am sure you have seen and understood me." It would be impossible to say what Emma felt on hearing this, which of all her unpleasant sensations was uppermost. She was too completely overpowered to be immediately able to reply, and 2 moments of silence being ample encouragement for Mr. Elton's sanguine state of mind, he tried to take her hand again, as he joyously exclaimed, "Charming Miss Woodhouse, allow me to interpret this interesting silence. It confesses that you have long understood me." "No, sir," cried Emma, "it confesses no such thing. So far from having long understood you, I have been in a most complete error with respect to your views, till this moment. As to myself, I am very sorry that you should have been giving way to any feelings. Nothing could be farther from my wishes. Your attachment to my friend Harriet, your pursuit of her, pursuit, it appeared, gave me great pleasure, and I have been very earnestly wishing you success. But had I supposed that she were not your attraction to Hartfield, I should certainly have thought you judged ill in making your visit so frequent. Am I to believe that you have never sought to recommend yourself particularly to Miss Smith, that you have never thought seriously of her?" "Never, madam," cried he, affronted in his tone. "Never, I assure you. I think seriously of Miss Smith. Miss Smith is a very good sort of girl, and I should be happy to see her respectably settled. I wish her extremely well, and, no doubt, there are men who might not object to. Everybody has their level. But as for myself, I am not, I think, quite so much at a loss. I need not so totally despair of an equal alliance as to be addressing myself to Miss Smith. No, madame, my visits to Hartfield have been for yourself only, and the encouragement I receive." "Encouragement? I give you encouragement? Sir, you have been entirely mistaken in supposing it. I have seen you only as the admirer of my friend. In no other light could you have been more to me than a common acquaintance." "I am exceedingly sorry, but it is as well that the mistake ends where it does. Had the same behaviour continued, Miss Smith might have been led into misconception of your views, not being aware, probably, any more than myself, of the very great inequality which you are so sensible of. But as it is, the disappointment is single, and I trust will not be lasting. I have no thought of matrimony at present." He was too angry to say another word. Her manner too decided to invite supplication, and in this state of swelling resentment and mutually deep mortification, they had to continue together a few minutes longer, for the fears of Mr. Woodhouse had confined them to a foot space. If there had not been so much anger, there would have been desperate awkwardness. But their straightforward motions left no room for the little zigzags of embarrassment. Without knowing when the carriage turned into the vicarage lane, or when it stopped, they found themselves all at once at the door of his house, and he was out before another syllable passed. Emma then felt it indispensable to wish him a good night. The compliment was just returned, coldly and proudly, and under indescribable irritation of spirits, she was then conveyed to Hartfield. There she was welcomed with the utmost delight by her father, who had been trembling for the dangers of a solitary drive from the vicarage lane, turning a corner which he could never have to think of, and in strange hands, a mere common coachman, no James. And there it seemed as if her return only were wanted to make everything go well, for Mr. John Knightley, ashamed of his ill humour, was now all kindness and attention, and so particularly solicitous on the comfort of her father as to seem, if not quite ready to join him in a basin of gruel, perfectly sensible of it being exceedingly wholesome. And the day was concluding in peace and comfort to all in their little party except herself. But her mind had never been in such perturbation, and it needed a very strong effort to appear attentive and cheerful till the usual hour of separating allowed her the relief of quiet reflection. And that's the end of chapter 15. Now, if you'll allow me a short pause to have a quick drink. Stretch. Very well. Allow me to. Now, thank you, but I dearly wish it weren't cheese. Naska, I thank you very kindly for the bits. I do so appreciate it. Now, some brief reflections on the chapter before we press on, I think. So, we finally have the confession of Mr. Elton of his affection, not to Harriet, but to Emma herself, much to Emma's dismay, and, if not perhaps surprise, for she has recently become aware of it, and certainly in violation of her own aims and plans. And of course it must be equally heartbreaking to Mr Elton, who thought himself on quite firm ground. But perhaps he was a little less than seemly in making his approach so far out of the public eye and so far removed from any intervention. Still, for a man sure of himself, for a man who speaks such words as Mr Elton did, no doubt he thought it a sure thing, and his heartbreak and embarrassment must be equal to Emma's own. A poor thing on both sides, and still more to come. I shall have another swallow of water for the benefit of my throat, and then we shall press on to chapter 16, if that is agreeable to all of you. Oh yes, that reminds me. There's something I forgot to mention before we press on. I had meant to say at the start of things, but it quite slipped my mind. Given that this is a modification to an existing sort of stream, it occurred to me that it might also work as a potential reward for our upcoming 50 follower goal. Which is to say that, depending on if you liked it or not, I might offer to do this again for the next Torrid Tuesday after we reach 50 followers. Now, I am judging only by the reception I have received, but I do think you're enjoying it, so I shall firmly say now that I am very willing for that to be the case. At any rate, let us press on. And I'm glad you're enjoying it. Chapter 16. The hair was curled, and the maid sent away, and Emma sat down to think and be miserable. It was a wretched business indeed, such an overthrow of everything she had been wishing for, such a development of everything most unwelcome, such a blow for Harriet. That was the worst of all. Every part of it brought pain and humiliation of some sort or other, but compared with the evil to Harriet, all was light, and she would gladly have submitted to feel yet more mistake, more in error, more disgraced by misjudgment than she actually was, could the effects of her blunders have been confined to herself. If I had not persuaded Harriet into liking the man, I could have borne anything. He might have doubled his presumption to me, but poor Harriet. How could she have been so deceived? He protested that he had never thought seriously of Harriet. Never. She looked back as well as she could, but it was all confusion. She had taken up the idea, she supposed, and made everything bend to it. His manners, however, must have been unmarked, wavering, dubious, or she could not have been so misled. The picture! How eager he had been about the picture, and the charade, and 100 other circumstances. How clearly they had seemed to point to Harriet. To be sure, the charade, with its ready wit, but then the soft eyes. In fact, it suited neither. It was just a jumble without taste or truth. Who could have seen through such thick-headed nonsense? Certainly she had often, especially of late, thought his manners to herself unnecessarily gallant. But it had passed as his way, as a mere error of judgment, of knowledge, of taste, as one proof among others that he had not always lived in the best society, and with all the gentleness of his address, true elegance was sometimes wanting. But, till this very day, she had never for an instant suspected it to mean anything but grateful respect to her as Harriet's friend. To Mr. John Knightley she was indebted for her first idea on the subject, the first start of its possibility. There was no denying those brothers had penetration. She remembered what Mr. Knightley had once said to her about Mr. Elton, the caution he had given, the conviction he had professed that Mr. Elton would never marry indiscreetly, and blushed to think how much truer a knowledge of his character had been there shown than any she had reached herself. It was dreadfully mortifying, but Mr. Elton was proving himself, in many respects, the very reverse of what she had meant and believed him. Proud, assuming, conceited, very full of his own claims, and little concerned about the feelings of others. Contrary to the usual course of things, Mr. Elton's wanting to pay his address to her had sunk him in her opinion. His professions and his proposals did him no service. She thought nothing of his attachment, and was insulted by his hopes. He wanted to marry well, and having the arrogance to raise his eyes to her, pretend to be in love, but she was perfectly easy as to his not suffering any disappointment that it need to be cared for. There had been no real affection, either in his language or manners. Sighs and fine words had been given in abundance, but she could hardly devise any set of expressions, or fancy any tone of voice less allied with real love. She need not trouble herself to pity him. He only wanted to aggrandize and enrich himself, and if Miss Woodhouse of Hartfield, the heiress of £30,000, not quite so easily obtained as he had fancied, he would soon try for Miss Somebody Else with 20, or with 10. But that he should talk of encouragement, should consider her as aware of his views, accepting his attention, meaning, in short, to marry him, should suppose himself her equal in connection or mind, look down upon her friend, so well understanding the gradations of rank below him, and so blind to what rose above, as to fancy himself showing no presumption in addressing her. It was most provoking. Perhaps it was not fair to expect him to feel how very much he was her inferior in talent, and all the elegance of mind. The very want of such equality might prevent his perception of it. But he must know that in fortune and consequence she was greatly his superior. He must know that the Woodhouses had been settled for several generations at Hartfield, the younger branch of a very ancient family, and that the Eltons were nobody. The landed property of Hartfield certainly was inconsiderable, being but a sort of notch in the Donwell Abbey estate, to which all the rest of Highbury belonged. But their fortunes, from other sources, were such as to make them scarcely secondary to Donwell Abbey itself in every other kind of consequence. And the Woodhouses had long held a high place in the consideration of the neighbourhood, which Mr. Elton had first entered not 2 years ago, to make his way as he could, without any alliances but in trade, or anything to recommend him to notice but his situation and his civility. But he had fancied her in love with him. That evidently must have been his dependence, and after raving a little about the seemingly incongruity of gentle manners and a conceited head, Emma was obliged, on common honesty, to stop and admit that her own behaviour to him had been so complacent and obliging, so full of courtesy and attention as, supposing her real motives unperceived, might warrant a man of ordinary observation and delicacy like Mr Elton, in fancying himself a very decided favourite. If she had so misinterpreted his feelings, she had little right to wonder that he, with self-interest to blind him, should have mistaken hers. The first error and the worst lay at her door. It was foolish, it was wrong, to take so active a part in bringing any two people together. It was adventuring too far, assuming too much, making light of what ought to be a trick of what ought to be simple. She was quite concerned and ashamed, and resolved to do such things no more. "Here have I," she said, "actually talked poor Harriet into being very much attached to this man. She might never have thought of him but for me, and certainly never would have thought of him with hope if I had not assured her of his attachment. For she is as modest and humble as I used to think him. Oh, that I had been satisfied with persuading her not to accept young Martin. There I was quite right. That was well done of me. But there I should have stopped and left the rest to time and chance. I was introducing her into good company, and giving her the opportunity of pleasing someone worth having. I ought not to have attempted more. But now, poor girl, her peace is cut up for some time. I have been but half a friend to her, and if she were not to feel this disappointment so very much, I am sure I have not an idea of anybody else who would be at all desirable for her. William Cox? Oh no, I could not endure William Cox, a pert young lawyer." She stopped to blush and laugh at her own relapse, and then resumed a more serious, more dispiriting cognition upon what had been, and might be, and must be. The distressing explanation she had to make to Harriet, and all that poor Harriet would be suffering, with the awkwardness of future meetings, the difficulties of continuing or discontinuing, the acquaintance of subduing feelings, concealing resentment, and avoiding eclat, were enough to occupy her in most unmirthful reflections some time longer, and she went to bed at last with nothing settled, with the conviction of her having blundered most dreadfully. The youth and natural cheerfulness like Emma's, though under temporary gloom at night, return of day will hardly fail to bring return of spirits. The youth and cheerfulness of morning are in happy analogy, and of powerful operation, and if the distress be not poignant enough to keep the eye unclosed, they will be sure to open to sensations of softened pain and brighter hope. Emma got up on the morrow more disposed for comfort than she had gone to bed, more ready to see alleviations of the evil before her, and to depend on getting tolerably out of it. It was a great consolation that Mr Elton should not really be in love with her, or so particularly amiable as to make it shocking to disappoint him. That Harriet's nature should not be of that superior sort, in which the feelings are most acute and retentive, what had passed except the three principals, and especially for her father's being given a moment's uneasiness about it. These were very cheering thoughts, and the sight of a great deal of snow on the ground did her further service, for anything was welcome that might justify their all three being quite asunder at present. The weather was most unfavourable for her, though Christmas Day she could not go to church. Mr Woodhouse would have been miserable had his daughter attempted it, and she was therefore safe from either exciting or receiving unpleasant and most unsuitable ideas. The ground covered with snow, and the atmosphere in that unsettled state between frost and thaw, which is of all others the most unfriendly for exercise. Every morning beginning in rain or snow, and every evening settling into freeze, she was for many days a most honourable prisoner. No intercourse with Harriet possible but by note, no church for her on Sunday any more than on Christmas Day, and no need to find excuses for Mr Elton's absenting himself. It was weather which might fairly confine everybody at home, and though she hoped and believed him to be really taking comfort in some society or other, it was very pleasant to have her father so well satisfied with his being all alone in his own house, too wise to stir out, and to hear him say to Mr Knightley, whom no weather could keep entirely from them, "Ah, Mr Knightley, why do you not stay at home like poor Mr Elton?" These days of confinement would have been, but for her private perplexities, remarkably comfortable, as such a seclusion exactly suited her brother, whose feelings must always be of great importance to his companions. And he had, besides, so thoroughly cleared of his ill humour at Randall's, that his amiableness never failed him during the rest of his stay at Hartfield. He was always agreeable and obliging, and speaking pleasantly of everybody, but with all the hopes of cheerfulness, and all the present comfort of delay, there was still such an evil hanging over her in the hour of explanation with Harriet as made it impossible for Emma to ever be perfectly at ease. And that is the end of chapter 16. Now, normally at this point I would do a small amount of reflection, have my drink and press on, but we are but 2 or 3 minutes from the start of the ad break, and while I could pause it, I do not think even in pausing it we should have time to progress through, well, a whole nother chapter before we should reach it. Having said that, we now have a moment or two where we are at a bit of an impasse. I shall take my drink and do my discussion. Oh, I appear to have disappeared. Well, thank you kindly, Abbe. I shall drink. Hopefully I shall reappear in the time it takes. Alas, it doesn't seem so. Let's see if we can't repair this. I did have something to say, actually, speaking of redeems. So whilst we wait, let me say this. For those of you who are familiar with my redeems, you will know I have a number of redeems, in which it is that I speak your chosen message. Indeed, this entire stream is somewhat in mirror of one of those particular redeems. The one called "Speak to me as you would one who you held close." Oh good, I'm back. And I thought I would take a moment to point out to you that, given the nature of this stream, our more standard redeem, that being the 500-point "Speak with the voice of the spirits," is now very much the same sort of redeem. So if you are of a thrifty mind, this would be the time to take advantage. While we wait for the adverts to come on. Now while I give you time to digest this idea, let's press on with a little bit of the analysis of the story, shall we? Not much happened in this chapter. Oh look, a minute until the ads. What timing? Yes, not much happened in this chapter. Emma spends some time reflecting on the nature of her issues, in self-recrimination, quite understandably. Plague is my favourite. Where was I? Some quite understandable self-recrimination. for of course her own ill actions have reflected upon her friend. A mistake not only confined to herself for a change, but at the same time she wakes in good spirits, and the weather seems to be poised to ameliorate her mistakes. How fortuitous, how wonderful. Of course, we are far from snow at this time. I suspect all of us to be suffering somewhat from the heat. Indeed, a refreshing snowfall might be quite lovely. But of course, that is, I suppose, dependent upon us still being able to reach out to one another through such channels as we currently employ. Were the internet to go down with it, perhaps a snowstorm would be far from pleasant. And no doubt it would say some terribly catastrophic things about the nature of the climate. Other than that, though, we also see a little peek into some of the politics of society, so typical of the Regency. Emma immediately picks herself out as a higher class of person than Mr Elton, her family older, belonging to a higher class of people, more well established. A remarkable thing to be, no? More of a person, or a more important person. The striations of class are much, much more strict, and perhaps as usual for our current time. Though indeed, I'm sure Mr Elton would argue himself to be no lesser than her, the second daughter of this family, and seemingly of few prospects. Emma does have a very high opinion of herself, though whether it is fair to say it is inflated is a question left up to the reader, I suppose. But while she does not happen to be the first sister, she has no brother, and so is likely to receive split inheritance. And of course, there are some questions about the nature of Mr Elton's qualification. A man of the church, not without station, but a station quite different from gentlemanlyhood, or I should say a gentle person, of course. What else is there to say? Not too much, I suppose. Well, I suppose that, given reflection, the delight with which one finds avoiding church might be seen as quite, how would you say, sinful, perhaps. Or perhaps this is too strong of a word. I cannot say, never having been a man or rat of faith myself. Now though, the ad breaks come to an end, so I shall have one more swallow of water before we resume our reading. And we are back, and having returned, let us press on. Chapter 17. Mr. and Mrs. John Knightley were not detained long at Hartfield. The weather soon improved enough for those to move who must move, and Mr. Woodhouse, having, as usual, tried to persuade his daughter to stay behind with all her children, was obliged to see the whole party set off, and return to his lamentations over the destiny of poor Isabella. Which poor Isabella, passing her life with those she doted on, full of their merits, blind to their faults, and always innocently busy, might have been a model of right and feminine happiness. The evening of the very day on which they went brought a note from Mr. Elton to Mr. Woodhouse, a long, civil, ceremonious note, to say, with Mr. Elton's best compliments, that he was proposing to leave Highbury the following morning in his way to Bath, where, in compliance with the pressing entreaties of some friends, he had engaged to spend a few weeks, and very much regretted the impossibility he was under, from various circumstances of weather and business, of taking a personal leave of Mr Woodhouse, of whose friendly civilities he should ever retain a grateful sense, and had Mr Woodhouse any commands, should be happy to attend to them. Emma was most agreeably surprised. Mr Elton's absence just at this time was the very thing to be desired. She admired him for contriving it, though not able to give him much credit for the manner in which it was announced. Resentment could not have been more plainly spoken than in civility to her father, from which she was so pointedly excluded. She had not even a share in his opening compliments. Her name was not mentioned, and there was so striking a change in all this, and such an ill-judged solemnity of leave-taking in his grateful acknowledgments, as she thought at first, could not escape her father's suspicion. It did, however. Her father was quite taken up with the surprise of so sudden a journey, and his fears that Mr Elton might never get safely to the end of it, and saw nothing extraordinary in his language. It was a very useful note, for it supplied them with fresh matter for thought and conversation during the rest of their lonely evening. Mr Woodhouse talked over his alarm, and Emma was in spirits to persuade them away with all her usual promptitude. She now resolved to keep Harriet no longer in the dark. She had reason to believe her nearly recovered from her cold, and it was desirable that she should have as much time as possible for getting the better of her other complaint before the gentleman's return. She went to Mrs Goddard's accordingly the very next day to undergo the necessary penance of communication, and a severe one it was. She had to destroy all the hopes which she had been so industriously feeding. To appear in the ungracious character of the one preferred, and acknowledge herself grossly mistaken and misjudging in all her ideas on one subject, all her observations, all her convictions, all her prophecies for the last 6 weeks. The confession completely renewed her first shame, and the sight of Harriet's tears made her think that she should never be in charity with herself again. Harriet bore the intelligence very well, blaming nobody, and in everything testifying such an ingenuousness of disposition and lowly opinion of herself as must appear with particular advantage at that moment to her friend. Emma was in the humour to value simplicity and modesty to the utmost, and all that was amiable, all that ought to be attaching, seemed on Harriet's side, not her own. Harriet did not consider herself as having anything to complain of. The affection of such a man as Mr Elton would have been too great a distinction. She never could have deserved him, and nobody but so partial and kind a friend as Miss Woodhouse would have thought it possible. Her tears fell abundantly, but her grief was so truly artless that no dignity could have made it more respectable in Emma's eyes, and she listened to her and tried to console her with all her heart and understanding, really for the time convinced that Harriet was the superior creature of the two, and that to resemble her would be more for her own welfare and happiness than all that genuine or intelligent, that genius or intelligence could do. It was rather too late in the day to set about being simple-minded and ignorant, but she left her with every previous resolution confirmed of being humble and discreet, and repressing imagination all the rest of her life. Her second duty now, inferior only to her father's claims, was to promote Harriet's comfort, and endeavour to prove her own affection in some better method than by matchmaking. She got her to Hartfield, and showed her the most unvarying kindness, striving to occupy and amuse her, and by books and conversation to drive Mr Elton from her thoughts. Time, she knew, must be allowed for this being thoroughly done, and she could suppose herself but an indifferent judge of such matters in general, and very much inadequate to sympathize in attachment to Mr. Elton in particular. But it seemed to her reasonable that at Harriet's age, with the entire extinction of all hope, such a progress might be made towards a state of composure by the time Mr. Elton's return, as to allow them all to meet again in the common routine of acquaintance without any danger of betraying sentiments or increasing them. Harriet did think him all perfection, and maintained the non-existence of anybody equal to him in person or goodness, and did, in truth, prove herself more resolutely in love than Emma had foreseen. "Oh, hello, Wilde. Glad to have you." We're still working our way through Emma, and in the last 2 chapters and a half, we have had the unfortunate confession of Mr. Elton to dear Emma herself, showing he had no affection for Harriet, and the rejection and the reflections of Emma upon the problem. Though Mr. Elton has, rather graciously, contrived to take a visit to Bath and be away for some time, so as to give things time to settle, and Emma is now in the process of comforting Harriet. And welcome in to the 100th stream, Wilde. I do so appreciate your presence. And did, in truth, prove herself more resolutely in love than Emma had foreseen. And yet it appeared to her so natural, so inevitable to strive against an inclination of that sort, unrequited, that she could not comprehend it continuing very long in equal force. If Mr. Elton, on his return, made his own indifference as evident and indubitable as she could not doubt he would anxiously do, she could not imagine Harriet's persisting to place her happiness in the sight or the recollection of him. Their being fixed, so absolutely fixed, in the same place, was bad for each, for all 3. Not one of them had the power of removal, or of effecting any material change of society. They must encounter each other and make the best of it. Harriet was further unfortunate in the tone of her companions at Mrs. Goddard's. Mr. Elton being the adoration of all the teachers and great girls in the school, and it must be at Hartfield only that she could have any chance of hearing him spoken of with cooling moderation or repellent truth. Where the wound had been given, there must the cure be found, if anywhere, and Emma felt that, till she saw her in the way of cure, there could be no true peace for herself. And that's the end of chapter 17. Again, I shall take a quick pause to have a drink and give some small reflection, though again quite a short chapter. Let me have my drink first, and then we will talk. And so Emma faces the consequences of her own actions, the heartbreak of her dear friend. And Harriet, of course, so pushed, so driven, so told of the affections of the man, remains in love with him. But the heart does not simply turn itself off. A sorrow and a shame. Still, I'm certain that by persevering they might, in time, come to change things. Now, having said this, I think there's little else to say, so we shall push on. I think at this point I shall say that we shall push for 2 more chapters tonight. Though perhaps if one is particularly long we may call it before. If both are particularly short, we shall push for a 3rd. I'm glad you're enthused, Abba. But yes, we shall attempt for 2 more, with the hope of going some point past the past the hour that is coming. That is to be my goal, I think. So, to that end, let us press on. After all, it's important that Wilde be given the chance to get the badge. Oh, not at all. For all that it took some change to the setup to achieve this, if anything, this particular style of reading is somewhat easier on my voice, though it does take some getting used to. It's something to consider for the future. But indeed, for the time being, let us push on. Chapter 18. Mr. Frank Churchill did not come. When the time proposed drew near, Mrs. Weston's fears were justified in the arrival of a letter of excuse. For the present he could not be spared, to his very great mortification and regret. But still he looked forward with the hope of coming at Randall's at no distant period. Well, perhaps I will. It is perhaps a worthy experiment, though unfortunately, given that I have now set it as the goal for 50 followers, I could not possibly do it again until we reach such a milestone, or I would be untrue to my own word. How dreadful. But he still looked forward with the hope of coming to Randall's at no distant period. Mrs. Weston was exceedingly disappointed, much more disappointed, in fact, than her husband, though her dependence on seeing the young man had been so much more sombre. But a sanguine temper, though forever expecting more good than occurs, does not always pay for its hopes by any proportionate depressions. It soon flies over the present failure, and begins to hope again. For half an hour, Mr. Weston was surprised and sorry. But then he began to perceive that Frank's coming, 2 or 3 months later, would be a much better plan. Better time of year, better weather, and that he would be able, without any doubt, to stay considerably longer with them than if he had come sooner. These feelings rapidly restored his comfort, while Mrs. Weston, of a more apprehensive disposition, foresaw nothing but a repetition of excuses and delays. And after all, her concern was for what her husband was to suffer, but she suffered a great deal more herself. Emma was not at this time in a state of spirits to care really about Mr. Frank Churchill's not coming, except as a disappointment to Randall's. The acquaintance at present had no charm for her. She wanted, rather, to be quiet in and out of temptation. But still, as it was desirable that she should appear, in general, like her usual self, she took care to express as much interest in the circumstance, and enter as warmly into Mr. and Mrs. Weston's disappointment as might naturally belong to their friendship. She was the first to announce it to Mr. Knightley, and exclaimed quite as much as was necessary, or, being acting a part, perhaps rather more, the conduct of the Churchills in keeping him away. She then proceeded to say a good deal more than she felt, of the advantage of such an addition to their confined society in Surrey, the pleasure of looking at somebody new, the gala day of Highbury attire which the sight of him would have made, and ending with reflections on the Churchills again, found herself directly involved in a disagreement with Mr. Knightley, and to her great amusement perceived that she was taking the other side of the question from her real opinion, and making use of Mrs. Weston's argument against herself. "The Churchills are very likely in fault," said Mr. Knightley coolly, "but I dare say he might come if he would." "I do not know why you should say so. He wishes exceedingly to come, but his uncle and aunt will not spare him. I cannot believe that he has not the power of coming, if he made a point of it. It is too unlikely for me to believe it without proof." "How odd you are! What has Mr. Frank Churchill done to make you suppose him such an unnatural creature? I am not supposing him at all an unnatural creature, in suspecting that he may have learned to be above his connections, and to care very little for anything but his own pleasure from living with those who have always set him the example of it. It is a great deal more natural than one could wish that a young man brought up by those who are proud, luxurious, and selfish should be proud, luxurious, and selfish too. If Frank Churchill has wanted to see his father, he would have contrived it between September and January. A man at his age, what is he? 3 or 4 and 20, cannot be without the means of doing as much as that. It is impossible. That's easily said and easily felt by you, who have always been your own master. You are the worst judge in the world, Mr. Knightley, of the difficulties of dependence. You do not know what it is to have tempers to manage. It is not to be conceived that a man of 3 or 4 and 20 should not have liberty of mind or limb to that amount. He cannot want money. He cannot want leisure. We know, on the contrary, that he has so much of both that he is glad to get rid of them at the idlest haunts in the kingdom. We hear of him forever at some watering place or other. A little while ago he was at Weymouth. That proves he can leave the Churchills. Yes, sometimes he can. And those times are, wherever he thinks it worth his while, whenever there is any temptation or pleasure. It is very unfair to judge of anybody's conduct without an intimate knowledge of their situation. Nobody who has not been in the interior of a family can say what the difficulties of an individual of that family may be. We ought to be acquainted with Enscombe and with Mrs. Churchill's temper before we pretend to decide upon what her nephew can do. He may at times be able to do a great deal more than he can at others. There is one thing, Emma, which a man can always do if he chooses, and that is his duty. Not by manoeuvring and finessing, but by vigour and resolution. It is Frank Churchill's duty to pay this attention to his father. He knows it to be so, by his promises and messages. But if he wishes to do it, it might be done. A man who felt rightly would say at once, simply and resolutely, to Mrs. Churchill, "Every sacrifice of mere pleasure you will always find me ready to make, to your convenience, but I must go and see my father immediately. I know he would be hurt by my failing in such a remark of respect to him on the present occasion. I shall therefore set off tomorrow." If he would say so to her at once, in the tone of decision, becoming a man, there would be no opposition made to his going. "No," said Emma, laughing, "but perhaps there might be made to his coming back again. Such language for a young man entirely dependent to use. Nobody but you, Mr. Knightley, would imagine it possible, but you have not an idea of what it requires in a situation directly opposite to your own. Mr. Frank Churchill to be making such a speech as that to the uncle and aunt who have brought him up and are to provide for him, standing up in the middle of the room, I suppose, and speaking as loud as he could. How can you imagine such conduct practicable? Depend upon it, Emma, a sensible man would find no difficulty in it. He would feel himself in the right, and the declaration, made, of course, as a man of sense would make it, in a proper manner, would do him more good, raise him higher, fix his interest stronger with the people he depended upon, than all a line of shifts and expedients can ever do. Respect would be added to affection. They would feel that they could trust him, that the nephew, who had done rightly by his father, would do rightly by them, for they know, as well as he does, as well as all the world must know, that he ought to pay this visit to his father, and while merely exerting their power to delay it, are in their hearts not thinking the better of him for submitting to their wishes. Respect for right conduct is felt by everybody. If he would act in this sort of manner, on principle, consistently, regularly, their little minds would bend to his. I rather doubt that. You are very fond of bending little minds, but where little minds belong to rich people in authority, I think they have a knack of swelling out, till they are quite unmanageable as great ones. I can imagine that if you, as you are, Mr. Knightley, were to be transported and placed all at once in Mr. Frank Churchill's situation, you would be able to say and do just what you have been recommending for him, and it might have a very good effect. The Churchills might not have a word to say in return, but then you would have no habits of early obedience and long observance to break through. To him who has, it might not be so easy to burst forth at once into perfect independence, and set all their claims on his gratitude and regard at naught. He may have as strong a sense of what would be right as you can have, without being equal, under particular circumstances, to act for it. Thank you, Wild. I shall sit up a little straighter for the next bit of this. The unfortunate nature of reading such texts as these is that one tends to slouch somewhat. I'll keep my posture a little lighter. Without being so equal under particular circumstances to act up to it. Then it would not be so strong a sense. If it failed to produce equal exertion, it could not be an equal conviction. Oh, the differences of situation and habit. I wish you would try to understand what an amiable young man may be likely to feel in directly opposing those whom, as a child and boy, he has been looking up to all his life. Your amiable young man is a very weak young man, if this be the first occasion of his carrying through a resolution to do right against the will of others. It ought to have been a habit with him by this time of following his duty instead of consulting expediency. I can allow for the fears of the child, but not of the man. When he became rational, he ought to have roused himself and shaken off all that was unworthy in their authority. He ought to have opposed the first attempt on their side to make him slight his father. Had he begun as he ought to, there would have been no difficulty now. We shall never agree about him, cried Emma, and that is nothing extraordinary. I have not the least idea of his being a weak young man. I feel sure that he is not. Mr. Weston would not be blind to folly, though in his own son, but he is very likely to have a more yielding, complying, mild disposition than would suit your notions of a man's perfections. I dare say he has, and though it may cut him off from some advantages, it will secure him many others. Yes, all the advantages of sitting still when he ought to move, and of leading a life of mere idle pleasure, and fancying himself extremely expert in finding excuses for it. He can sit down and write a fine flourishing letter, full of professions and falsehoods, and persuade himself that he has hit upon the very best method in the world of preserving peace at home, and preventing his father's having any right to complain. His letters disgust me. Your feelings are singular. They seem to satisfy everybody else. I suspect they do not satisfy Mrs. Weston. They hardly can satisfy a woman of her good sense and quick feelings, standing in a mother's place, but without a mother's affection to blind her. It is on her account that attention to Randalls is doubly due, and she must doubly feel the omission. Had she been a person of consequence herself, he would have come, I dare say, and it would not have signified whether he did or no. Can you think your friend behindhand in these sorts of considerations? Do you suppose she does not often say all this to herself? No, Emma, your amiable young man can be amiable only in French, not in English. He may be very amiable, but have very good manners, and be very agreeable, but he can have no English delicacy towards the feelings of other people. Nothing really amiable about him. You seem determined to think ill of him. Me? Not at all, replied Mr. Knightley, rather displeased. I do not want to think ill of him. I should be as ready to acknowledge his merits as any other man, but I hear of none, except what are merely personal, that he is well grown and good-looking, with smooth, plausible manners. Well, if you have nothing else to recommend him, he will be a treasure at Highbury. We do not often look upon fine young men, well-bred and agreeable. We must not be nice and ask for all the virtues into the bargain. Cannot you imagine, Mr. Knightley, what a sensation his coming will produce? There will be but one subject throughout the parishes of Donwell and Highbury, but one interest, one object of curiosity. It will be all Mr. Frank Churchill. We shall think and speak of nobody else. You will excuse my being so much overpowered. If I find him conversable, I shall be glad of his acquaintance, but if he is only a chattering coxcomb, he will not occupy much of my time or thought. My idea of him is that he can adapt his conversations to the taste of everybody, and has the power as well as the wish of being universally agreeable. To you he will talk of farming, to me of drawing or music, and so on to everybody, having that general information on all subjects which will enable him to follow the lead, or take the lead, just as propriety may require, and to speak extremely well on each. That is my idea of him. And mine, said Mr. Knightley, warmly, is that if he turns out anything like it, he will be the most insufferable fellow breathing. What? At 23 to be the king of his company, the great man, the practised politician, who is to read everybody's character and make everybody's talents conduce to the display of his own superiority, to be dispensing his flatteries around, that he may make all appear like fools compared with himself. My dear Emma, your own good sense could not endure such a puppy when it came to the point. I will say no more about him, cried Emma. You turn everything to evil. We are both prejudiced, you against, I for him, and we have no chance of agreeing till he is really here. Prejudiced? I am not prejudiced, but I am very much, and without being at all ashamed of it. My love for Mr. and Mrs. Weston gives me as dedicated prejudice in his favour. He is a person I never think of from one month's end to another, said Mr. Knightley, with a degree of vexation, which made Emma immediately talk of something else, though she could not comprehend why he should be angry. To take a dislike to a young man only because he appeared to be of a different disposition from himself was unworthy the real liberality of mind which he was always used to acknowledge in him. With all the high opinion of himself which he had often laid to his charge, she had never before for a moment supposed it could make him unjust to the merit of another. And that's the end of chapter 18. I shall take once again a quick drink. And again, we have one of those of my favourite scenes in Regency romance, the courtly argument, the strident disagreement between two people both being very cordial to one another, so as to avoid offence. I do think they're such a fun little idea, and here within them I read something perhaps undue, but perhaps not. For I suspect Emma is somewhat right, in that Mr. Knightley is a little prejudiced against the young man they are speaking of. But Emma is entirely unaware of why. Well, I think I may have some idea. I wonder, my dear Chad, if you yourself apprehend an equal interest between the two, one of which Emma is, of course, unaware, as she was unaware of Mr. Weston's. Perhaps I'm wrong. It is very subtle and in the very early stages. But I like to think so. At any rate, I think we shall press for one more, but I shall take a moment here to just check a little ahead and see about the length of the preceding chapters, to see if perhaps it might be that we should press for more than one more. The next chapter is only 8 pages, so fairly short. We should see the time we make, but I think indeed we will likely press for a third. At any rate, unless anyone has anything else to say, I shall have one more quick swallow of water, for I feel rather dry, and then press on. Very good. Chapter 19. Emma and Harriet had been walking together one morning, and, in Emma's opinion, had been talking enough of Mr Elton for that day. She could not think that Harriet's solace or her own sins required more, and she was therefore industriously getting rid of the subject as they returned. But it burst out again when she thought she had succeeded, and after speaking some time of what the poor must suffer in winter, and receiving no other answer than a very plaintive "Mr Elton is so good to the poor," she found something else must be done. They were just approaching the house where lived Mrs and Miss Bates. She determined to call upon them and seek safety in numbers. There was always sufficient reason for such attention. Mrs and Miss Bates loved to be called on, and she knew she was considered by very few who presumed ever to see imperfections in her as rather negligent in that respect, and as not contributing what she ought to the stock of their scanty comforts. She had had many a hint from Mr Knightley, and some from her own heart, as to her deficiency, but none were equal to counteract the persuasions of being very disagreeable, a waste of time, tiresome women, and all the horror of being in danger of falling in with the second-rate and third-rate of Highbury, who were calling on them forever, and therefore she seldom went near them. But now she made the sudden resolution of not passing their door without going in, observing, as she proposed it to Harriet, that as well as she could calculate, they were just now quite safe from any letter from Jane Fairfax. The house belonged to people in business. Mrs and Miss Bates occupied the drawing-room floor, and there, in the very modest-sized apartment, which everything to them, their visitors, were most cordially and even gratefully welcomed, the quiet, neat old lady, who with her knitting was seated in the warmest corner, wanting even to give up her place to Miss Woodhouse, with her own more active, talking daughter, almost ready to overpower them with her care and kindness. Thanks for their visit, solicitude for their shoes, anxious inquiry after Mrs Woodhouse's health, or after Mr Woodhouse's health, cheerful communications about her mother, and sweet cake from the buffet. Mrs Cole has just called in for her 10 minutes, and she had been so good as to sit an hour with them, and she had taken a piece of cake, and been so kind as to say she liked it very much, and therefore she hoped Miss Woodhouse and Miss Smith would do the same favour to eat a piece too. The mention of the Coles was sure to be followed by that of Mr Elton. There was an intimacy between them, and Mr Cole had heard from Mr Elton since he was going away. Emma knew what was coming. They must have the letter over again, and settle how long he had been gone, and how much he was engaged in company, and what a favourite he was wherever he went, and how full the master of ceremonies all had been, and she went through it very well, and with all the interest, and all the commendation that could be requisite, and always putting forward to prevent Harriet's being obliged to say a word. This she had been prepared for when she entered the house, but meant, having once talked him handsomely over, to be no further incommoded by any troublesome topic, and to wander at large amongst all the mistresses and misses of Highbury and their card parties. She had not been prepared to have Jane Fairfax succeed Mr Elton, but he was actually hurried off by Miss Bates. She jumped away from him at last abruptly to the coals to usher in a letter from her niece. "Oh yes, Mr Elton, I understand. Certainly as to dancing. Mrs Cole was telling me that dancing at the rooms at Bath was... Mrs Cole was so kind to sit some time with us talking of Jane, for as soon as she came in she began inquiring after her. Jane is so very great a favourite there. Whenever she is with us, Mrs Cole does not know how to show her kindness enough, and I must say that Jane deserves it as much as anybody can. And so she began inquiring after her directly, saying, 'I know you cannot have heard from Jane lately, because it is not her time for writing.' And when I immediately said, 'But indeed, we have had a letter this very morning,' I do not know that I ever saw anybody more surprised. 'Have you upon your honour?' said she. 'Well, that is quite unexpected. Do let me hear what she says.' Emma's politeness was at hand directly, to say, with smiling interest, 'Have you heard from Miss Fairfax so lately? I am extremely happy. I hope she is well.' 'Thank you, you are so kind,' replied the happily deceived aunt, while eagerly hunting for the letter. 'Oh, here it is. I was sure it could not be far off, but I had put my housewife upon it, you see, without being aware, and so it was quite hid. But I had it in my hand so very lately that I was almost sure it must be on the table. I was reading it to Mrs Cole, and since she went away I was reading it again to my mother, for it is such a pleasure to her, a letter from Jane, that she can never hear it often enough. So I knew it could not be far off, and here it is, only just under my housewife, and since you are so kind as to wish to hear what she says. But first of all, I really must, in justice to Jane, apologize for her writing so short a letter. Only 2 pages, you see, hardly 2, and in general she fills the whole paper and crosses half. My mother often wonders that I can make it out so well. She often says when the letter is first opened, 'Well, Hattie, now, I think we'll be put to it to make all that checker work. Don't you, ma'am?' And then I tell her I am sure she would contrive to make it out herself if she had nobody to do it for her, every word of it. I am sure she would pore over it till she had made out every word. And indeed, though my mother's eyes are not so good as they were, she can see amazingly well still, thank God, with the help of spectacles. It is such a blessing. My mothers are really very good, indeed. Jane often says when she is here, 'I am sure, Grandma, you must have had very strong eyes to see as you do. So much fine work as you have done, too. I only wish my eyes may last me as well.' All this spoken extremely fast obliged Miss Bates to stop for a breath, and Emma said something very civil about the excellence of Miss Fairfax's handwriting. 'You are extremely kind,' replied Miss Bates, highly gratified. 'You who are such a judge, and write so beautifully yourself. I am sure there is nobody's praise that could give us as much pleasure as Miss Woodhouse's.' My mother does not hear. She is a little deaf, you know. Ma'am,' addressing her, 'do you hear what Miss Woodhouse is so obliging as to say about Jane's handwriting?' And Emma had the advantage of hearing her own silly compliment repeated twice over before the good lady could comprehend it. She was pondering in the meanwhile upon the possibility, without seeming very rude, of making her escape from Jane Fairfax's letter, and almost resolved on hurrying away directly under some slight excuse, when Miss Bates turned to her again and seized her attention. 'My mother's deafness is very trifling, you see. Just nothing at all. By only raising my voice and saying anything 2 or 3 times over, she is sure to hear, but then she is used to my voice. But it is very remarkable that she could always hear Jane better than she does me. Jane speaks so distinct. However, she will not find her grandmamma at all deafer than she was 2 years ago, which is saying a great deal at my mother's time of life. And it really is 2 full years, you know, since she was here. We never were so long without seeing her before, and as I was telling Mrs. Cole, we shall hardly know how to make enough of her now. Are you expecting Miss Fairfax here soon? Oh yes, next week. Indeed, that must be a very great pleasure. Thank you. You are very kind. Yes, next week. Everybody is so surprised, and everybody says the same obliging things. I am sure she will be as happy to see her friends at Highbury as they can be to see her. Yes, Friday or Saturday. She cannot say which, because Colonel Campbell will be wanting the carriage himself one of those days. So very good of them to send her the whole way. They always do, you know. Oh yes, Friday or Saturday next. That is what she writes about. That is the reason of her writing out a rule, as we call it. For in the common course we should not have heard from her before next Tuesday or Wednesday. Yes, so I imagined. I was afraid there could be little chance of my hearing anything of Miss Fairfax today. So obliging of you. No, we should not have heard of it if it had not been for this particular circumstance of her being to come here so soon. My mother is so delighted, that she is to be 3 months with us at least. 3 months, she says, so positively, as I am going to have the pleasure of reading to you. The case is, you see, that the Campbells are going to Ireland. Mrs. Dixon has persuaded her father and mother to come over and see her directly. They had not only intended to go over till the summer, but she is so impatient to see them again. But till she married last October, she was never away from them so much as a week, which must make it very strange to be in the different kingdoms. I was going to say, but however different countries, and so she wrote a very urgent letter to her mother, or her father, I declare I do not know which it was, but we shall see presently in Jane's letter. Wrote in Mr. Dixon's name as well as her own, to press their coming over directly, and they would give them a meeting in Dublin and take them back to their country seat, Ballycraig, a beautiful place, I fancy. Jane has heard a great deal of its beauty, from Mr. Dixon, I mean. I do not know that she ever heard about it from anybody else. It was very natural, you know, that he should like to speak of his own place while he was paying his addresses. And as Jane used to be very often walking out with them, the Colonel and Mrs. Campbell were very particular about their daughters not working out often with only Mr. Dixon, for which I do not at all blame them. Of course she heard everything he might be telling Miss Campbell. I don't know why that chime just played. Everything he might be telling about Miss Campbell, about his own home in Ireland. And I think she wrote us word that he had shown them some drawings of the place, views that he had taken himself. He is a most amiable, charming young man, I believe. Jane was quite longing to go to Ireland, from his accounts of things. There it is again. Curious. I don't know what that can be. At this moment, an ingenious and animating suspicion entering Emma's brain with regard to Jane Fairfax, this charming Mr. Dixon, and the not going to Ireland, she said with the insidious design of further discovery, "You must feel it very fortunate that Miss Fairfax should be allowed to come to you at such a time, considering the very particular friendship between her and Mr. Dixon, or Mrs. Dixon. You could hardly have expected her to be excused from accompanying the Colonel and Mrs. Campbell." Very true indeed. The very thing that we have always been rather afraid of. We should not have liked to have her at such a distance from us for months together, not be able to come if anything was to happen. But you see, everything turns out for the best. They want her, Mr. and Mrs. Dixon, excessively to come over with Colonel and Mrs. Campbell. Quite depend upon it. Nothing can be more kind or pressing than their joint invitation, Jane says, as you will hear presently. Mr. Dixon does not seem in the least backwards in any attention. He is a most charming young man. Ever since the service he rendered Jane at Weymouth, when they were out in that patty on the water, and she by the sudden whirling round of something or other among the sails would have been dashed into the sea at once, naturally was all but gone if he had not, with the greatest presence of mind, caught hold of her halberd. I can never think of it without trembling. But ever since we have this history of that day, I have been so fond of Mr. Dixon. But in spite of all her friend's urgency and her own wish of seeing Ireland, Miss Fairfax preferred devoting the time to you and Mrs. Bates. Yes, entirely her own doing, entirely her own choice. And Colonel and Mrs. Campbell think she does quite right, just what they should recommend. And indeed they particularly wish her to try her native air, as she has not been quite so well as usual lately. I am concerned to hear of it. I think they judge wisely, but Mrs. Dixon must be very much disappointed. Mrs. Dixon, I understand, has no remarkable degree of personal beauty, is not by any means to be compared with Miss Fairfax. Oh no, you are very obliging to say such things, but certainly not. There is no comparison between them. Miss Campbell always was absolutely plain, extremely elegant and amiable. Yes, of course. Jane caught a bad cold, poor thing, so long ago as the 7th of November, as I am going to read to you, and has never been well since. A long time, is it not, for a cold to hang upon her? She never mentioned it before, because she would not alarm us, just like her, so considerate. But, however, she is not so far from well that her friends in the Campbells think she had better come here, and try the air that always agrees with her. And they have no doubts that 3 or 4 months of Highbury will entirely cure her. It is certainly a great deal better than she should come here than go to Ireland if she is unwell. Nobody could nurse her as we should do. It appears to me the most desirable arrangement in the world. And so she is to come to us next Friday or Saturday, and the Campbells leave town in their way to Highbury or to Holyhead the Monday morning, or the Monday following, as you will find from Jane's letter. So sudden! You may guess, dear Miss Woodhouse, what a flurry it has thrown me in. If it were not for the drawback of her illness, but I am afraid we must expect to see her grown thin and looking very poorly. I must tell you what an unlucky thing happened to me, as to that I always make a point of reading Jane's letters through for myself, first, before I read them aloud to my mother, you know, for fear of there being anything in them to distress her. Jane desired me to do it, so I always do. I began today with my usual caution, but no sooner did I come to the mention of her being unwell than I burst out, quite frightened, with, "Bless me, poor Jane is ill," which my mother, being on the watch, heard distinctly, and was sadly alarmed at. However, when I read on, I found it was not near so bad as I had fancied at first, and I made so light of it now to her that she does not think much about it. But I cannot imagine how I could be so off my guard. If Jane does not get well soon, we will call on Mr. Perry. The expense shall not be thought of, and though he is so liberal and so fond of Jane that I dare say he would not mean to charge anything for her attendance, we could not suffice it to be so, you know. He has a wife and family to maintain, and is not to be giving away his time. Well now, I have just given you a hint of what Jane's written about. We will turn to her letter, and I am sure she tells her own story a great deal better than I can tell it for her. "I'm afraid we must be running away," said Emma, glancing at Harriet and beginning to stir, or to rise, sorry. "My father will be expecting us. I had no intention. I thought I had no power of staying more than 5 minutes when I first entered the house. I merely called because I would not pass the door without inquiring after Miss Bates. But I have been so pleasantly detained. Now, however, we must wish on you and Mrs. Bates good morning." And all that could be urged to detain her succeeded. She regained the street, happy in this, that though much had been forced on her against her will, though she had in fact heard the whole substance of James Fairfax's letter, she had been able to escape the letter itself. That's the end of chapter 19. And as I say, I do want to just check how long it is, but I think we will press on through 20. Yeah, 20 is not so very long. Yeah, only 6 pages, even shorter than 19, so I'll have a quick swallow of water. And a little reflection. I felt a little rushed by that chapter. Again, I've sometimes noted that a style lends itself to difficulty of reading. And the character with which they were speaking, Mrs. Bates, Miss Bates, I should say, was written with rather little punctuation, such that it was intended to be coming across as breathless and rushed, but I did rather think I might have done a bit of disservice to the format by keeping to it, so not too much to say about this chapter, of course. Harriet is no doubt still pining for Mr Elton, as expected, and Jane Fairfax, with whom Emma has some minor dislike, is coming to town. A thing to be said indeed. I was about to press on, but it occurs to me, you know what? The ads are coming on, but I think we shall pause them this time. I've no tolerance for them, so we shall simply press on. I think we can manage, inside time, to finish, so... Chapter 20. Jane Fairfax was an orphan, the only child of Mrs. Bates' youngest daughter. The marriage of Lieutenant Fairfax of the unnamed Regiment of Infantry and Miss Jane Bates had in its day of fame and pleasure, hope and interest, but nothing now remained of it, save the melancholy remembrance of him dying in action abroad, of his widow sinking under consumption and grief soon afterwards, and this girl. By birth she belonged to Highbury, and when at 3 years old, on losing her mother, she became the property, the charge, the consolation, the foundling of her grandmother and aunt, there had seemed every probability of her being permanently fixed there, of her being taught only what very limited means could command, and growing up with no advantage of connection or improvement be engrafted on what nature had given her in a pleasing person, good understanding, and warm-hearted, well-meaning relations. But the compassionate feelings of a friend of her father gave a change to her destiny. This was Colonel Campbell, who had very highly regarded Fairfax as an excellent officer and most deserving young man, and father had been indebted to him for such attentions during a severe camp fever as he believed had saved his life. These were claims which he did not learn to overlook, though some years passed away from the death of poor Fairfax before his own return to England put anything in his power. When he did return, he sought out the child and took notice of her. He was a married man, with only one living child, a girl about Jane's age, and Jane became their guest, paying them long visits and growing a favourite with all. And before she was 9 years old, his daughter's great fondness for her, and his own wish of being a real friend, united to produce an offer from Colonel Campbell of undertaking the whole charge of her education. It was accepted, and from that period Jane had belonged to Colonel Campbell's family, and had lived with them entirely, only visiting her grandmother from time to time. The plan was that she should be brought up for educating others, then very few £100, which she inherited from her father, making independence impossible. To provide for her otherwise was out of Colonel Campbell's power, for though his income by pay and appointments was handsome, his fortune was moderate, and must be all his daughter's. But by giving her an education, he hoped to supply the means of respectable subsistence hereafter. And there are the ads, let's snooze them. Done. Such was Jane Fairfax's history. She had fallen into good hands, known nothing but kindness from the Campbells, and been given an excellent education. Living constantly with right-minded and well-intentioned people, Her heart and understanding had received every advantage of discipline and culture, and Colonel Candle's residence being in London, every light to talent had been done full justice to by the attendance of first-rate masters. Her disposition and abilities were equally worthy of all that friendship could do. At 18 or 19, she was, as far as such an early age can be qualified for the care of children, fully competent to the office of instruction herself. But she was too much beloved to be parted with. Neither father nor mother could promote, and the daughter could not endure it. The evil day was put off. It was easy to decide that she was still too young, and Jane remained with them, sharing as another daughter in all the rational pleasures of an elegant society and a judicious mixture of home and amusement, with only the drawback of the future, the sobering suggestions of her own good understanding to remind her that all this might soon be over. The affection of the whole family, the warm attachment of Miss Campbell in particular, was the more honourable to each party from the circumstance of Jane's decided superiority, both in beauty and acquirements. That nature had given it in feature could not be unseen by the young woman, nor could her higher powers of mind be unfelt by the parents. They continued together with unabated regard, however, till the marriage of Miss Campbell, who by that chance, that luck which so often defies anticipation in matrimonial affairs, giving attraction to what is moderate rather than to what is superior, engaged the affections of Mr. Dixon, a young man rich and agreeable almost as soon as they were acquainted, and which eligibly and happily settled, while Jane Fairfax had yet her bread to earn. This event had very lately taken place, too lately for anything to yet be attempted by her less fortunate friend towards entering on her path of duty. Though she had now reached the age which her own judgment had fixed on for beginning, she had long resolved that 21 should be the period. With the fortitude of a devoted novitiate, she had resolved at 21 to complete the sacrifice, and retire from all the pleasures of life, of rational intercourse, equal society, peace and hope, to penance and mortification forever. The good sense of Colonel and Mrs. Campbell would not oppose such a resolution, though their feelings did. As long as they lived, no exertions would be necessary. Their home might be hers forever, and for their own comfort they would have restrained her wholly, but this would be selfishness. What must be at last had better be soon. Perhaps they began to feel it might have been kinder and wiser to have resisted the temptation of any delay, and spared her from a taste of such enjoyments of ease and leisure as must now be relinquished. Still, however, affection was glad to catch at any reasonable excuse for not hurrying on the wretched moment. She had never been quite well since the time of their daughter's marriage. Until she should have completely recovered her usual strength, they must forbid her any engagement in duties which, so far from being compatible with a weakened frame and varying spirits, seemed, under the most favourable circumstances, to require something more than human perfection of body and mind to be discharged with tolerable comfort. With regard to her not accompanying them to Ireland, her account to her aunt contained nothing but truth, though there might be some truths not told. It was her choice to give the time of their absence to Highbury, to spend perhaps her last months of perfect liberty with those kind relations to whom she was so very dear. And the Campbells, whatever might be their motive or motives, whether single or double or treble, gave the arrangement their ready sanction, and said that they depended more on the few months spent in her native air for the recovery of her health than on anything else. Certain it was that she was to come, and that Highbury, instead of welcoming that perfect novelty which had been so long promised it, Mr. Frank Churchill, must put up for the present with Jane Fairfax, who could bring only the freshness of a scarce 2 years' absence. I was under the mistaken impression that pausing the ad break would pause it for 15 minutes. but it has paused it only for 5. Ah well, I have 3 of them if I need it, I suppose. Let us press on. Emma was sorry to have to pay civilities to a person she did not like through 3 long months, be always doing more than she wished and less than she ought. Why she did not like Jane Fairfax might be a difficult question to answer. Mr. Knightley had once told her it was because she saw in her the really accomplished young woman which she wanted to be thought herself, and though the accusation had been eagerly refuted at the time, there were moments of self-examination in which her conscience could not quite acquit her. But she could never get acquainted with her. She did not know how it was, but there was such coldness and reserve, such apparent indifference whether she pleased or not. And then her aunt was such an eternal talker, and she was made such a fuss with by everybody, and it had always been imagined that they were to be so infinite, because their ages were the same. Everybody supposed they must be so fond of each other. These were her reasons. She had no better. It was a dislike so little just. Every imputed fault was so magnified by fancy that she never saw Jane Fairfax the first time, after any considerable absence, without feeling that she had injured her. And now, when the due visit was paid, on her arrival after a 2 years' interval, she was particularly struck with the very appearance and manners, which for those 2 whole years she had been depreciating. Jane Fairfax was very elegant, remarkably elegant, and she had herself the highest value for elegance. Her height was pretty, just such as almost everybody would think tall, and nobody could think very tall. Her figure particularly graceful, her size a most becoming medium between fat and thin. The slight appearance of ill health seemed to point out the likeliest evil of the 2. Emma could not but feel all this, and then her face, her features. There was more beauty in them altogether than she had remembered. It was not regular, but it was very pleasing beauty. Her eyes, a deep grey, with dark eyelashes and eyebrows, had never been denied their praise, but the skin which she had been used to cavil at as wanting colour had a clearness and delicacy which really needed no fuller bloom. It was a style of beauty of which elegance was the reigning character, and as such she must, in honour by all her principle, admire it. Elegance, which whether of person or mind, she saw so little in Highbury. There, not to be vulgar, was distinction and merit. In short, she sat, during the first visit, looking at Jane Fairfax with 2-fold complacency. The sense of pleasure and the sense of rendering justice was determining that she would dislike her no longer. When she took in her history. I really don't know what's doing that. I wonder if perhaps there's chat happening that is no longer showing for me, given the number of times that it's writing itself. Let's refresh chat. Does not seem to be the case. Strange. When she took in her history, indeed her situation as well as her beauty, when she considered what all this elegance was destined to, what she was going to sink from, how she was going to live, it seemed impossible to feel anything but compassion and respect. Especially if to every well-known particular entitling her to interest were added the highly probable circumstance of an attachment to Mr. Dixon, which she had so naturally started to herself. In that case, nothing could be more pitiable or more honourable than the sacrifices she had resolved on. Emma was very willing now to acquit her of having seduced Mr. Dixon's affections from his wife, or of anything mischievous which her imagination had suggested at first. If it were love, it might be simple, single, successless love on her side alone. She might have been unconsciously sucking in the sad poison, while a sharer of his conversation with her friend. And, from the best of the purest of motives, might now be denying herself this visit to Ireland, and resolving to divide herself effectually from him and his connections by soon beginning her career of laborious duty. Upon the whole, Emma left with such softened charitable feelings as made her look around in walking home and lament that Highbury afforded no young man worthy of giving her independence, nobody she could wish to scheme about for her. Those were some charming feelings, but not lasting. Before she had committed herself by any public profession of eternal friendship for Jane Fairfax, or done more towards a recantation of past prejudice and errors than saying to Mr. Knightley, "She is certainly handsome, she is better than handsome." Jane had spent an evening at Hartfield with her grandmother and aunt, and everything was relapsing much to its usual state. Former provocations reappeared. The aunt was as tiresome as ever, more tiresome because anxiety for her health was now added to admiration of her powers. And they had to listen to the description of exactly how little bread and butter she ate for breakfast, and how small a slice of mutton for dinner, as well as to see exhibitions of new caps and new work bags for her mother and herself, and Jane's offences rose again. They had music, Emma was obliged to play, and the thanks and praises which necessarily followed appeared to be an affectation of candour, an air of greatness, merely only to show off in higher style her own very superior performance. She was besides, which was the worst of all, so cold, so cautious. There was no getting at her real opinion. Wrapped up in a cloak of politeness, she seemed determined to hazard nothing. She was suspiciously reserved. If anything could be more, or all was most, she was more reserved on the subject of Weymouth and the Dixons than anything. She seemed bent on giving no real insight into Mr. Dixon's character, or her own value for his company, or opinion of the suitableness of the match. It was all general approbation and smoothness, nothing delineated or distinguished. It did her no service, however. Her caution was thrown away. Emma sought its artifice and returned to her first surmises. There probably was something more to conceal than her own preference. Mr. Dixon, perhaps, had been very near changing one friend for the other, or been fixed only to Miss Campbell for the sake of the future £12,000. The like reserve prevailed on other topics. She and Mr. Frank Churchill had been at Weymouth at the same time. It was known that they were a little acquainted, but not a syllable of real information could Emma procure as to what he truly was. Was he handsome? She believed he was reckoned by a very fine young man. Was he agreeable? He was generally thought so. Did he appear a sensible young man of information? At a watering place or in common London acquaintance, it was difficult to decide on such points. Manners were all that could be safely judged of, under a much longer knowledge than they had yet had of Mr. Churchill. She believed everybody found his manners pleasing. Emma could not forgive her. And with that, we have reached the end of chapter 21, and, tempted as I am to press on, I know that for the good of my own throat, and for the sake of propriety and keeping my word, we shall have to end here for the night. Much as the evening has been so pleasant, I think it is time now that I blow out our candle and return to the more normal air of things. Excuse me. Lamp. There we are. Now, I do not think we have too much time before the adverts once again try to play, but we'll give a little bit of consideration. This chapter we have the introduction of Jane Fairfax and her tragic story. Thank you again, Abbe, and thank you once more for the subscription. I do so appreciate it. But yes, the introduction of Miss Jane Fairfax. A new character, an antagonist to Emma, one on whom her imagination is now fixed. I could say more, but we do not really see much of her character, and what we do see is pretty plainly laid out in the text, so we should call it there. Instead, let me once again thank you all for joining me on today the 100th. I hope you've enjoyed this variation to our usual stream, and I hope you will enjoy it again in the future, if we are lucky enough to hit our goal. I think we should raid out to Plague tonight, as she has just begun streaming. And I only have 45 seconds, so I have no particular wish to let the ads start rolling before we leave, so I shall hurry my end I do hope you have all enjoyed it. I hope you have a very lovely rest of your day, up until, of course, the next stream I do, which may or may not be tomorrow. I shall judge on the time. But as always, I thank you for joining me, and ta-ra!